You know what most people don't understand about cruelty? It's not always loud. It doesn't always look like rage or violence. Sometimes the deepest wounds come wrapped in ordinary words, spoken at a dinner table, delivered with a shrug like they're nothing more than observations about the weather. And the person saying them? They might not even realize they've just planted a seed that will grow into something dark and unshakable for decades. I'm going to tell you about a woman I'll call Joanna. I met her when she was 37 years old, sitting in my office with perfect posture and a rehearsed smile that never quite reached her eyes. She came to me because, as she put it, she was fine, really fine, but her husband thought maybe talking to someone would help her feel less tired all the time. That's how she said it. Less tired. As if exhaustion was the problem, when really it was just the symptom of a life spent trying to be someone she could never become. Joanna spent the first 3 sessions telling me about her career, her children, her volunteer work at the local library. She spoke about her life the way someone might read from a resume, listing accomplishments with all the warmth of a weather report. But in our 4th session, something shifted. I asked her a simple question. Joanna, when was the last time you felt truly proud of yourself? And for the first time since I'd met her, she went completely still. Not frozen in fear, but still in the way someone goes still when they realize they've just been asked to solve an equation they've never learned the formula for. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said something I'll never forget. My parents used to say I wasn't half the woman my sister is. And you know what? They were right. Let me tell you where you're watching this from in the comments. I want to know if this kind of comparison showed up in your childhood too, because I've learned over the years that this particular wound is far more common than we'd like to admit. It cuts across cultures, across economic classes, across every boundary we think might protect us from it. Joanna grew up the younger of 2 daughters in what she called a perfectly normal family. Her father was an accountant. Her mother taught elementary school. They lived in a 3-bedroom house with a tidy lawn in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business, and appearing successful mattered more than actually being happy. Her sister, Lauren, was 3 years older, and from Joanna's earliest memories, Lauren was the sun around which their family orbited. Lauren was beautiful in that effortless way some people are. Tall, athletic, with thick dark hair that fell in perfect waves without any effort. She excelled at everything she touched. Straight A's without studying. Captain of the volleyball team. Lead in the school musical. She had that kind of natural charisma that made teachers remember her name and other parents point her out as an example to their own children. And the thing about Lauren, she wasn't even mean. She wasn't a villain. She was genuinely kind, which somehow made everything worse for Joanna. Because how do you compete with someone who is not only better than you at everything, but also nicer? Joanna described herself as ordinary. Average height, average grades, average at sports, average at making friends. She said the word average like it was a diagnosis, something terminal and shameful. But here's what I learned as she told me her story. Joanna wasn't average at all. She was observant. She was thoughtful. She had this quiet creativity that showed up in the poems she wrote in secret and the way she could make her little cousins laugh until they couldn't breathe. But in her family, none of that counted because it didn't come with trophies or report cards that could be displayed like proof of worth. The comparison started early. Joanna couldn't remember a time when she wasn't being measured against her sister. Lauren got all A's this semester. What happened with your math grade, Joanna? Or, Lauren made varsity as a freshman. Maybe you should try harder at tryouts next year. Or, your sister just has a natural way with people, doesn't she? Here's what happens in a child's brain when they're constantly compared unfavorably to a sibling. They start to build their identity around the deficit. The mind doesn't just register, I'm different from my sister. It registers, I am less than my sister. And that becomes the lens through which they interpret every experience, every interaction, every quiet moment alone with their thoughts. It's not just low self-esteem. It's something more insidious. It's a fundamental belief that your existence is somehow second-rate, that you were assigned a supporting role in the story of your own life. Joanna told me about the day everything crystallized for her. She was 14 years old. Lauren had just gotten accepted to an Ivy League university with a full scholarship. The whole family went out to celebrate at a nice restaurant, the kind of place they only went to for special occasions. Joanna wore her best dress, the blue one she'd saved her allowance to buy. She'd even practiced what she would say to congratulate her sister, rehearsing the words to make sure they sounded sincere and not jealous. At dinner, after the champagne toast, the adults had champagne. Joanna had sparkling cider. Her father stood up to make a speech. He talked about how proud he was of Lauren, how she represented everything they'd hoped for in a daughter, how she'd always been exceptional, always been destined for greatness. And then he turned to Joanna, and what he said next would echo in her head for the next 2 decades. "Joanna," he said, smiling at her with genuine affection, "you may not be half the woman your sister is, but we love you just the same." The table laughed. It was meant as a joke, one of those teasing comments families make at celebrations. Her mother playfully swatted her father's arm. Lauren looked uncomfortable, but didn't say anything. And Joanna? Joanna smiled and laughed along with everyone else, because that's what you do when you're 14, and you want to be normal and likable and not the person who ruins the celebration with hurt feelings. But inside, something broke. Or maybe it's more accurate to say something solidified. All those years of subtle comparisons, all those moments of feeling less than, they all crystallized into a single belief. I am not enough. I will never be enough. And the people who are supposed to love me unconditionally have confirmed it in front of everyone. Have you ever had a moment like that? A moment when something someone said casually became the truth you lived by for years? Drop a comment if you have, because I think we all carry these moments, and sometimes just naming them helps us see them for what they really are. Joanna went home that night and threw away every poem she'd ever written. She took down the drawings she'd pinned to her wall. She decided that if she couldn't be exceptional like Lauren, she would at least be useful, helpful, easy. She would be the daughter who didn't cause problems, who didn't need attention, who could be counted on to fade into the background while everyone else shined. And for the next 23 years, that's exactly who she became. When Joanna walked into my office, she had built an entire life around being useful. She married a man she described as stable and kind, which in therapy speak often means someone I don't have strong feelings about, but who seemed like a safe choice. She had 2 children, both under 10, and she devoted herself to them with an intensity that looked like love, but felt, as she eventually admitted, more like an attempt to give them what she'd never had, unconditional acceptance without comparison. She worked part-time as an administrative assistant at a medical office, the kind of job that requires competence, but not creativity, where you can clock in and clock out without taking any of it home. She volunteered at the library every Tuesday. She organized playdates and bake sales and neighborhood cleanups. She was, by all external measures, doing fine. Maybe even better than fine. But here's what I've learned after decades of listening to people. You can't outrun the voice that was planted in your childhood. You can build a whole life around proving it wrong, or you can build a whole life around making sure no one notices it's there. But either way, it's still there. It's there when you look in the mirror. It's there when you're trying to fall asleep. It's there in every decision you make, whispering that you're not quite enough, that you need to try harder, be smaller, expect less. The breaking point came on an ordinary Tuesday. Joanna was at the library, shelving books in the children's section, when she overheard 2 mothers talking in the next aisle. One was complaining about her daughter's piano recital, how the girl had messed up in the middle of her piece. The other mother said, "Well, at least she's not like Jessica's youngest. That poor girl will never be as talented as her older sister." Joanna's hand stopped moving. She stood there, holding a picture book about a bunny who learns to be brave, and something inside her just shattered. Not broke, shattered. Like glass hitting concrete. She put the book down carefully, walked to the bathroom, locked herself in a stall, and for the first time in 23 years, she let herself feel the full weight of that dinner table comment. She let herself feel the rage and grief and bewilderment of being 14 years old and hearing your father tell a room full of people that you're fundamentally lesser than your sibling, and everyone just laughing like it's funny. Here's what happens in the body when we finally stop running from old pain. The nervous system, which has been on guard for years, finally has permission to stand down. And when it does, everything it's been holding floods out. Joanna told me she cried so hard in that bathroom stall that she threw up. Not from sickness, but from the sheer physical release of decades of suppressed feeling. When she finally came out, mascara smudged, hands shaking, one of the librarians asked if she was okay. And Joanna said, and this was the moment she knew she needed help, "I don't know who I am." That's what brought her to therapy. Not depression, exactly, though she was depressed. Not anxiety, though she had plenty of that too. What brought her was the sudden, terrifying realization that she was 37 years old and she had no idea who Joanna was when she wasn't trying to be useful, trying to be small, trying to be good enough for people who had decided long ago that she simply wasn't. We spent months unpacking what that dinner table comment had done. But more than that, we unpacked the entire system of comparison that had defined her childhood. Because here's the thing about family comparisons, they're rarely just about the comparison itself. They're about what gets valued and what gets ignored. In Joanna's family, achievement was valued. Charisma was valued. Conventional success was valued. But thoughtfulness, creativity, emotional depth, those things didn't count. They weren't measured, so they didn't matter. And Joanna had internalized that so completely that she'd spent her entire adult life trying to be measurable. Good wife, check. Good mother, check. Reliable employee, check. Helpful volunteer, check. She was collecting check marks like they might eventually add up to worthiness. I asked her once, "Joanna, what do you actually want? Not what you think you should want. Not what would make you useful. What do you want for yourself?" She stared at me. Then she started crying again, because she genuinely didn't know. She'd spent so long defining herself in relation to what other people needed that she'd lost any sense of her own desires, her own dreams, her own right to take up space in the world. Let me ask you something. Have you ever realized you've been living someone else's definition of success? That you've been trying to win a game whose rules were set by people who never even asked what you cared about? Comment below. Because this is where so many of us get stuck, and knowing you're not alone in it can be the first step toward finding your way out. The real work began when Joanna started to separate her worth from her usefulness. That's harder than it sounds. Our culture loves useful people, productive people, people who don't make waves and don't ask for too much and show up on time with a smile. To step away from that, to say, "I matter even when I'm not being productive," feels almost transgressive. Joanna started small. She started saying no to volunteer commitments she didn't actually care about. She started going to a pottery class on Thursday nights, something she'd always been curious about but had dismissed as not practical. She started therapy homework I'd given her. Every day, write down one thing you did for yourself, not for someone else. Just one thing. At first, her list was pathetic. I made tea the way I like it, not the way my husband likes it. I listened to a podcast I wanted to hear instead of just keeping the house quiet. But slowly, the list grew. I told my sister I couldn't make it to her party because I needed a weekend to rest. I applied for a job that actually interests me, even though it pays less. I bought myself flowers just because I wanted to see them on the kitchen table. This is the part of therapy that doesn't make it into movies. It's not dramatic. There's no moment of sudden enlightenment where orchestral music swells and everything makes sense. It's just a person day after day, making small choices that say, "I matter. My preferences matter. My life is mine to shape." Joanna's husband was confused at first. He'd married someone who never asked for anything, and suddenly she was asking for things. Not big things, but things. She wanted to renegotiate their division of household labor. She wanted him to put the kids to bed twice a week so she could have time to herself. She wanted to talk about her feelings instead of just asking about his day. Some of those conversations were hard, but he rose to the occasion because he actually did love her. He just hadn't realized she'd been disappearing. The hardest part? Confronting her parents. Joanna waited almost a year before she talked to her father. A year of therapy, of slowly building up her sense of self, of learning to trust that her feelings were valid even when they were inconvenient for other people. And even then, she almost didn't do it. She told me she must have picked up the phone to call him a dozen times before she actually went through with it. When she finally did, she didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just told him the truth. She told him about that dinner, about his comment, about how it had shaped her entire sense of self for more than 2 decades. She told him that she'd spent her whole life believing she was less than her sister because he'd said it and everyone had laughed and no one had ever told her it wasn't true. And you know what her father said? He didn't remember. He had no memory of that comment. It was to him a throwaway joke at a family dinner 23 years ago, forgotten within hours. But to Joanna, it had been the defining statement of her worth. That's the thing about words. The person who says them moves on, but the person who receives them carries them, sometimes forever. Her father apologized. Genuinely, tearfully apologized. He said he'd never meant to hurt her, that he loved both his daughters equally, that he was horrified to learn what his careless words had done. And Joanna believed him. But here's what she learned in that conversation, and what she shared with me afterward. His apology didn't erase the damage. It didn't give her back those 23 years. It didn't magically heal the wound. What it did do was release her from the need to keep proving herself to him, because she finally understood that his comment had never really been about her at all. It was about his own inability to see her clearly, his own narrow definition of success, his own failure to notice the beautiful, thoughtful, creative person sitting right in front of him. And that was his limitation, not hers. This is the hard truth about healing from childhood wounds. You don't get to go back and have a different childhood. You don't get to erase the damage. What you get to do is decide what it means going forward. You get to take the narrative that was handed to you and rewrite it, not by changing what happened, but by changing your relationship to it. Joanna's relationship with her sister also shifted, though in unexpected ways. Turns out, Lauren had her own struggles. Being the golden child comes with its own cage. She'd spent her life feeling like she had to be perfect, like any failure would disappoint everyone who'd invested so much in her success. She'd had a nervous breakdown in her late 20s and had been in therapy for years. The two of them had a conversation, the first real conversation they'd had in years, where they both admitted how much the comparison had hurt them, just in different ways. They're not best friends now. They probably never will be. But there's a tenderness between them that didn't exist before, a recognition that they both survived the same system, even if they survived it differently. What about Joanna now? She's 42. She took that job she'd applied for, working at a nonprofit that supports arts education in schools. It pays less than her old job, but she comes home energized instead of depleted. She still does pottery on Thursday nights. She's even started showing her work at local art fairs, not because she's trying to prove she's talented, but because it brings her joy and she's learned that joy is reason enough. Her relationship with her kids has changed too. She's more honest with them about her feelings. She apologizes when she makes mistakes. And most importantly, she makes sure they know they're loved not for what they achieve, but for who they are. She tells them she's proud of them, yes, but she also tells them she's proud of their kindness, their curiosity, their willingness to try new things even when they're scared. She measures them by standards she wishes someone had measured her by. So what's the lesson here? What do you take from Joanna's story? First, the words spoken to us in childhood have power, but they don't have to have the final say. You can spend decades believing something about yourself only to discover, when you finally examine it, that it was never true. It was just someone else's limited perspective, delivered at a vulnerable moment, and internalized because you didn't yet have the tools to question it. Second, comparison is a thief. It steals your ability to see your own value, because it's always measuring you against someone else's strengths while ignoring your own. Every person has their own constellation of gifts, their own way of moving through the world. When we compare, we reduce all that complexity to a single dimension, and someone always comes up short. Third, healing doesn't mean the wound disappears. Joanna still has moments when that old voice pipes up, telling her she's not enough. But now she recognizes it for what it is, an old recording, not a current truth. And she's learned to talk back to it. Some days that's easier than others. That's the nature of healing. It's not linear. It's not once and done. It's a practice like meditation or exercise, something you return to again and again. Fourth, and maybe most importantly, your life belongs to you. Not to your parents' expectations, not to your sibling's shadow, not to society's narrow definitions of success. It belongs to you, and you get to decide what makes it meaningful. Maybe that's a high-powered career. Maybe that's raising kids. Maybe that's making pottery in your garage and selling it at farmers markets. Maybe it's something no one in your family would ever think to value. It doesn't matter. What matters is that it's yours, chosen by you, for reasons that resonate with who you actually are, not who you think you should be. I want you to think about the comparisons you've carried. Maybe they came from parents, like Joanna's did. Maybe they came from teachers, from friends, from romantic partners, from the distorted mirror of social media. Maybe they came from inside your own head, constructed from 1,000 small messages about what makes a person valuable. Ask yourself, what would your life look like if you stopped trying to be better than someone else and started trying to be more yourself? What would you do differently? What would you let go of? What would you finally give yourself permission to want? These aren't rhetorical questions. I really want to know. Tell me in the comments. Tell me what comparison has shaped your life. Tell me what you're working to let go of. Tell me where you're watching from, because I believe we're all scattered across this world, carrying similar wounds, learning similar lessons, and sometimes just knowing someone else understands is enough to help us take the next step. Joanna gave me permission to share her story because she believes it might help someone else recognize themselves in it. She said to me, if even one person hears this and realizes they don't have to spend their whole life trying to be someone they're not, it'll be worth it. So here's what I'll leave you with. You are not half of anyone. You're not a fraction. You're not a lesser version. You're not the one who didn't measure up. You're whole, exactly as you are right now, with all your ordinariness and your specialness and your contradictions and your possibilities. The people who couldn't see that was their failure of vision, not your failure of being. And if you've spent years, like Joanna did, building a life around being useful rather than being yourself, it's not too late. It's never too late to come home to yourself, to shed the expectations that were never really yours, to discover what you actually want, what actually brings you joy, what actually makes your specific, irreplaceable life feel worth living. That's the work. That's the healing. And it's available to you right now, whenever you're ready to begin. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Thank you for trusting me with your time and your attention. I'll see you in the next one.